As a racist pilot pushes a billionaire black entrepreneur far away in the middle of a flight, the unexpected catastrophe is forced to face a man he underestimated, and all the shocking turns that follows are speechless. Mark Johnson leaned against the buttery leather sheet of his private jet, feeling familiar expectations. His journey brought him from a modest beginning to a climax of success. At 38, he was invited to be CEO of a thriving high-tech company to speak at one of Silicon Valley's most famous conferences. This flight should settle before the meeting hurricane, but something today felt like that. The cabin was small and luxurious, with refined walnut accents and luxurious carpets. Mark saw the other two passengers. An elderly woman in sharp clothes and a man in his 50s were deepened into thick paperbacks. The weak noise of the cleansing glasses came from the kitchen where the flight attendants prepared snacks. A sudden jerk interrupted Mark's thoughts. It wasn't turbulence. It was the pilot who finished with pilot Greg Turner, more strength than necessary. Mark looked up in confusion. He only stood for a short time to call the folder from the overhead compartment. "Ah, does that bother you?" Greg barked. His tone was sharp. "This is not a commuter service. Stay. Sit down." Mark blinked, surprised. "I reached out for myself." Greg cuts him off. "This is a private jet. You're not the only one on board." Words hanging down into the air like smoke. Mark's jaw is stuck, but he is forced to continue to form himself. He didn't want to derail someone's poor attitude. The older woman looked up temporarily, emptying her facial expression before returning to her phone. Mark was a folder with his knees and took a breath and muttered something as he saw Greg pulled back into the cockpit. It died, but Mark caught the word. From her lane. Mark let out a slow breath and grabbed the armrest. He met a man like Greg in front of a man who saw his success as a threat. Nevertheless, he remembered that this was just a flight. He wasn't here to either take the points or start a conflict. He was here to achieve his goals. A few minutes later, the flight attendant approached with a warm smile and offered Mark a drink. Her friendliness was the perfume, but the tension remained. Greg's actions nibbled upon the edges of Mark's thoughts, turning his routine into something much more offensive. What Mark didn't know was that this was just the beginning, and that the storm that preceded us should test him in a way that he didn't expect. The jet steadily summed up the clouds, but the atmosphere inside wasn't smooth. Mark attempts to focus on the stack of documents before him, but his thoughts continue to return to Greg's hostility. He was already in front of countless flights, but never acted like that. It was almost impossible to ignore anything about Greg's undeniable ability. About an hour after the flight began, Mark decided to stretch his legs out again. He went behind the cabin to get another water bottle. The door suddenly shook and almost slammed it as he passed the cockpit. "Are you trying to hear me?" Greg's voice was loud enough to turn his head. Frozen Mark. "What?" "No. I was free. I left the cockpit, grabbed Greg, squinted my eyes, searching for the brand as if I was looking for trouble. There is a protocol for a specific reason. Already thin, cracked, marking patience. With respect, I am not close to control. Just go to the rear of the aircraft." Greg crossed his arms mockingly. "Your person is always making excuses." The room seemed to hold his breath. The older woman above the aisle looked up again. This time her expression was tense, but the man moved uncomfortably into his seat with the book. Mark took a step forward. His voice is calm and hard. "I don't know what your problem is, but I would recommend you book it for yourself. I did nothing to win her rudeness." Greg's lips twitched with a smile. "I'm working now. Maybe they keep doing them whatever it is. I have it." The flight attendant seemed to have rinsed her face. "Mr. Turner," she said softly, "are everything okay here?" "It's fine," Greg said. He stared at Mark for the last time before closing the cockpit door. The sound echoed through the cabin. The peers provided Mark with an excessive look and lowered her voice. "Very sorry. He's not usually like that." Mark smiled and laughed, but the frustration erupted inside. This was not the first time he had been subjected to discrimination, but it never made it easy. He returned to his place and grabbed the armrests as he repeated encounters in his head. He could feel the eyes of his other passengers, and he felt her discomfort remarkably. But no one spoke. A few minutes later, the plane crashed lightly. It was just turbulence, but Mark's mind wasn't competing out of fear as tension pushed his nerves to the edges. Little did anyone know, there was no turbulence outside. A much bigger storm should be the focus, which will quickly change the balance of power. The cabin light flashes for a short time, followed by another jerk, which is more difficult than the last jerk. The fortified seat straps flashed in a bell game, and the flight attendants quickly secured a loose object. Mark saw the passenger from him. The older woman grabbed her armrests while the man was pale in the book, and his eyes went to the cockpit, heading towards the cockpit. Then it happened. The plane sank sharply to the left and sent a bottle of water from Mark to the floor. As the jet wobbled unevenly, beans erupted from the cabin. Mark felt a stab wound in his familiar stomach, but he didn't panic. That was the focus. Greg's nervous voice, "Women and gentlemen," barked the intercom, "Please calm down." An unexpected turbulence occurs. Mark's instinct told him it was more than turbulence. The irregular movement of the level felt mechanical rather than atmospheric. He saw the flight attendant whisper something to the cabin phone and saw her face pale as she looked at the cockpit and stole it. The jets convulsed again, and this time an oxygen mask was used in hiss. We took a collective breath and cleaned the cabin. Mark's ideas competed. He knew these systems weren't triggered easily. Something was wrong, and Greg could not deal with it. Suddenly, the cockpit door opened, Greg stumbling, his face immersed in sweat. His confident facade disappeared, and he panicked in pure panic. "Can someone fly a plane here?" The older woman stared at him with a relaxed core, and the man quickly shook his head with the book. It's packed with Mark's chess. He wanted to sit down and find him, but the mission was too expensive. His voice passed through the mixed chaos. Greg's head grabbed him incredibly over his face. "You? Don't be ridiculous." With a very towering frame, Mark was stable despite the trembling aircraft. "I am a licensed pilot. Do you want my help?" Greg just stared at him, his face resisting. Then when he came across his seat, another jerk sent him. He didn't answer, but his silence was an unspoken job. Mark moved towards the cockpit, the weight of each eye in the cabin. The confusion was even more evident as he entered the small, cramped room. A warning light flashed on the dashboard, causing controls to shaking violently in response to aircraft instability. It was a mess, but not outside of the rescue. He slid into the pilot's chair and grabbed the control. Years of training and private flights occurred when he was looking for warnings for his instruments and heights, airways, and systems. The turbulence outside was rough, but the bigger issue was Greg's fault. The aircraft flew unevenly, completely offsetting the balance. I muttered how his hands were moving exactly. His voice was calm, controlled, and hit him as adrenaline. The stabilization of the greedy axis. We made it. Greg freezes behind him, his mouth open. Are you really a pilot?" Mark did not answer. He was too focused on saving the plane. Every second, Mark's skills were revealed and there was no doubt. However, while he worked to stabilize the plane, the rest of the cabin was trying to completely disguise Greg's facade. The jet was under the mark. The wild dips and idiots thrown into panic after passengers left were replaced by smoother, controlled gliding. The relief spreads like waves into the cabin. The older woman visibly relaxed, but the man gave an audible sigh in the book. The mark remained laser-oriented, and as I adjusted the aircraft price, my hands moved quickly over the controls. The warning lights dimmed one after another, indicating that immediate dangers were under control. He watched the flight and set its height to avoid the worst turbulence. Greg floated behind him, and his early courage now took off completely. His face was pale and his hands trembled as he stuck to the doorframe. "How did you do that?" he stammered. Mark didn't see him. "Flight school," he said, that his sound was just cool and steady. "I received my pilot license years ago." Greg's disbelief was almost odd. He leaned against the wall and muttered in the air, "I wasn't thinking. Someone like you?" The mark cuts it out quite a bit. "People like me have just saved passengers, crew, and aircraft. Perhaps you'll think about it the next time you grab a skill." Greg's face fell, but he had no answer. He screamed back into the cabin, avoiding the passengers' eyes, watching the whole exchange. The flight attendants encouraged a mark through the door, a gentle expression of gratitude. As soon as the plane was fully stabilized, Mark rose from the cockpit. Passengers broke out with applause, their relief and gratitude. Mark held his hand and signaled that it wasn't necessary. "I did what everyone did in training," he said. His voice is calm but solid. "I don't need to thank myself." The older woman finally spoke, her voice trembling. "If it wasn't for them, I don't know what happened. This guy—" She led Greg's school. Greg seemed completely defeated, sinking into the corner. The atmosphere in the cabin was completely shifted. If Greg once ordered authorities, now there was only light empty. Where Mark was skeptical, he was now given respect and admiration. However, Mark's swift thinking brought him the trust of the passengers. But Greg's actions were not forgotten, and the fallout seemed likely to be quick and serious. The private jet was smoothed out at San Francisco International Airport and was welcomed by the usual stress of Bowden's crew and flashlights. However, this was not a normal landing for passengers. The tension that consumed the flight remained, but he had a collective sense of adoration and relief. Not only did Mark Johnson save his life, but he also had an unwavering calm in contrast to Greg Turner's previous actions. As passengers got off, the cabin filled it. It was not Greg's supposed expertise, but Mark's heroism. The older woman held her hands tightly. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was thick. They were the real captains of this flight. Mark offered a polite nod, but his gaze switched to Greg. The former confidential pilots now looked like covers. Mark didn't just feel deep sympathy. Outside the aircraft, the soil and a small team were waiting. One of the passengers, who was clearly still shaking, had already reported the incident. When Greg stepped into the asphalt, he was quickly pulled aside for investigation. The appearance of panic on his face spoke volume. Mark was not left to see it. He was not a public shade, no matter how much Greg deserved. Instead, he went to the waiting car and was ready to continue. However, when he reached the car, a young journalist rushed towards him and grabbed the microphone. "Mr. Johnson, we asked what happened on the flight. Please tell us more about the pilot's actions." Mark hesitated and turned to Jet. The memory of Greg's hostility and the moment he seemed to save the plane in his head. Finally, he returned to reporter. "It wasn't just the man's actions that happened there," Mark began, measuring his tone. "It's about the assumptions we encounter each other, and people believe they can see how they look and where they come from. Today, these assumptions are largely dependent on life expectancy." The reporter pushed further, but Mark held one hand high. "I said everything I needed. Let's focus on further development." When Mark arrived at the hotel, news about the incident had already spread. Social media summed up his quick thinking with praise, but Greg's name was trending for the wrong reasons. Film materials and aircraft surveillance systems have little space for interpretation. Greg's obvious hostility could not be denied. Within hours, the airline issued a formal apology to Mark, and announced Greg was fired. "We maintain our employees to the highest standards," the description says. When asked about further comments, Mark's answer was simple yet profound. "Forgiveness is a powerful thing," he told journalists in a follow-up interview. "But forgiveness does not mean that you ignore what happened. This means that it is used as a lesson to educate, grow, and ensure that the same error does not repeat." Within a few days, the story became a meeting cry for accountability and respect. Mark's words echoed well beyond the boundaries of the flight and influenced the conversation about the quiet path that uncovers prejudice and how important it is to stand up. In the meantime, Greg disappeared from the spotlight. Some said he moved to a small town to avoid counter-responses, while others speculated he was seeking help to combat prejudice. Mark doesn't deal with that. The lessons were being learned for him, so he hoped Greg had taken some of it as well. And ultimately, it wasn't just a story about the act of a single heroism. It was a memory of the strength of humility, the courage of the festival, and the strength to turn moments of prejudice into opportunities for growth.